Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? It is week 9, which means we are officially at the halfway point of the 2024 season. Insane to think that we're already here. It feels like we just started yesterday, but now it's the stretch run. Now we're thinking about the playoffs. What moves can we make to set ourselves up for the playoffs? And how many more games do we need to win to clinch a playoff spot? And even if your record isn't all that great right now, keep grinding. Ask everybody in the comments. There have been tons of people who have told us, hey, I've started off the season with maybe only 1 or 2 wins and still came all the way back to make the playoffs. It isn't over as of yet. Set your team up for success. Make sure you have an optimal lineup every single week, and we're going to make this run to a fantasy championship. And for running backs this week, we're actually kicking it off with a couple of really good running backs on Thursday Night Football. Joe Mixon and Breece Hall. The New York Jets are currently allowing the 9th most rushing yards to opposing running backs. And then you add on top of it, Nico Collins is not back yet, and more than likely we're going to be missing Stefon Diggs as well. Now, not only are the Houston Texans going to need to run the ball quite a bit, but that leaves some extra targets to dump off to Joe Mixon as well. Love his potential in this matchup going up against the New York Jets. You might as well keep the ball away from Aaron Rodgers as much as possible. I know he's not the same Aaron Rodgers he once was, but keep the ball in Joe Mixon's hands, push the ball down the field, secure the time of possession. Joe Mixon should end up having a really nice day. Breece Hall could end up having some upside issues in this matchup. Right now, the Houston Texans are allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to the running back position. Not only that, but it looked like the new coaching staff was firmly on the side of making Breece Hall the guy, giving him the bell cow touches and really kind of phasing Brandon Allen back to being somebody that only came in every once in a while and just spelled Breece Hall. But last week, he got back to double-digit carries, and we're going to need to keep an eye on whether that's going to be a trend or not. But that doesn't mean that Braylon Allen is back to being a guy that I think we can flex. If anything, he is just a must-own handcuff that you should have on your roster if you have Breece Hall. There were a ton of questions last week about Rico Dowdle. Then he showed up to the stadium on game day, ended up being sick and didn't even play. But what type of a rotation are we going to see moving forward? Keep in mind that Dalvin Cook was elevated from the practice squad before Rico Dowdle was even sick. So you definitely were going to see 3 running backs last week regardless. But this matchup is not where you want to be. Atlanta is currently allowing the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to the running back position, and they've only allowed 2 rushing touchdowns all season long. So not only is it a super tough matchup, but we don't know what type of a rotation we may see moving forward. And that's something that we're going to do this week. Personally, I would be leaving Rico Dowdle on the bench unless you are absolutely desperate and you have no other options. Bijan Robinson could be in for a really big day going up against the Dallas Cowboys, who currently allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game and the 2nd most rushing touchdowns to running backs. Now, Tyler Algier still is getting more touches than I would love, which can kind of hamper Bijan Robinson's upside a little bit. But really, Tyler Algier is being used as the closer. He's being used somewhat in the first quarter to kind of give Bijan a spell, but then Bijan is really the guy in the 2nd and the 3rd quarter. And then if the Atlanta Falcons are winning, they bring in Tyler Algier to try and help hammer home the win. So as a Bijan Robinson owner, you need to hope for neutral or negative game script for the Atlanta Falcons. If you get that heading into the 4th quarter, Bijan Robinson is still going to be the guy for Atlanta. But if you head into the 4th quarter with positive game script, Tyler Algier is probably going to be there to help limit that upside, which we don't love to see. This week against the Cowboys, he has potential to score a touchdown. We knew that the return of Tua was going to absolutely be needed for guys like Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, but I think everybody completely forgot about the effect that he has on the run game as well. And look what happened. Tua comes back, Achane has a big day with a touchdown, and Mostert scores 2 touchdowns as well. Now, it looks like Raheem Mostert is really going to be regulated to about a dozen attempts per game, and he's going to see some goal line touches as well. So Raheem Mostert right now is really one of those touchdown plays. He's more of a flex option for me that if he doesn't score a touchdown, he's probably going to be really underwhelming, but if he can find the end zone, we'll be solid. Devon Achane, though, is definitely in prime position this week because while Buffalo can be a little stingy on the ground, they allow the most receiving yards to opposing running backs, and we all know what Devon Achane can do in the passing game as well. Achane has some really nice upside this week based on that alone. The Miami Dolphins are currently allowing the second most rushing touchdowns and sixth most rushing yards to the running back position. So James Cook should be in line for a very solid week for fantasy purposes. Now, one thing that we talked about last week that we really needed to keep an eye on was Ray Davis. There were some concerns that we might see Ray Davis getting a few more touches. Those concerns were not founded last week because Ray Davis was not utilized in that game, and the hope is he's not utilized while James Cook continues to get bell cow touches. Okay, maybe I can recommend Alexander Mattison this week. Still don't love it, but the matchup isn't awful. Alexander Mattison right now is getting all of the touches out of the Las Vegas backfield. Zamir White, he's basically axed at this point. So when you take a look at the fact that this is a pretty decent matchup and Alexander Mattison is being utilized with carries on the ground and some targets through the air, he doesn't have a great ceiling this week, but he has a pretty solid floor. Now, if you ask me if you're going to start him as like your RB2 over some other options, you're probably going to get a no from me, dog. But if you ask me if you can flex him, absolutely, that is a conversation I'm willing to have. Las Vegas is inside the top 10 of most fantasy points allowed, most touchdowns allowed, and most rushing yards allowed to the running back position. Chase Brown has firmly taken over as the lead running back in Cincinnati. Those two things are going to make him my Manscaped must-start running back this week, and you need to be finding a place in your lineup for Chase Brown. And this week against Las Vegas, Chase Brown could absolutely clean up against the Raiders. But given the time of the year, it's getting a little bit cooler, beach season is done, maybe you've stopped cleaning up. I don't think that that's a good idea. And you should head on over to manscaped.com and check out all of the amazing tools that they have can help you get cleaned up, especially with the holidays here right now. And when you get ready to check out over at Manscaped, use code word HEADLINERS20. You're going to get 20% off of your entire order and free shipping. And not only is he my must start in any type of fantasy league this week, but if you're over on Underdog right now putting together lineups, he's definitely going to be a play for me right now. His rushing total is only set at 57.5 yards this week. Going up against Las Vegas, that seems too low. Let's bump that up and go higher than his current projection. Not only does he have an opportunity to go over 57.5 rushing yards, but he's got an opportunity to find the end zone as well. J.K. Dobbins has lost a little bit of the ceiling that we saw at the beginning of the year. Over his last 5 games, he only has one RB1 performance. Now, if you drafted J.K. Dobbins, you weren't drafting him to be your RB1 anyway. So it really isn't that big of a deal that he's not putting up RB1 numbers. What we need from J.K. Dobbins is a nice flex floor, and he does still continue to have that. Just the ceiling has disappeared a little bit, and it also has disappeared this week in a tough matchup going up against Cleveland. You definitely can find your way into the end zone with your running backs against the Browns, but it is harder to move the ball on the ground against them, and on top of that, it's pretty easy to pass it as well. So we could see J.K. Dobbins with a much lower ceiling this week, even if his floor is still solid enough to be considered for our flex. Nick Chubb still doesn't look like his old self, and that doesn't shock anybody. I don't think anyone even expected him to be back on the field right now, let alone putting up Nick Chubb-like numbers. So if you continue to play him, you're playing a highly volatile player that's definitely getting some okay volume right now, but may not have that explosiveness back for a few more weeks or maybe even its next season before you see Nick Chubb get some of that back. This is a really tough matchup, and the Chargers have only allowed one rushing touchdown all season long. Really, for me this week, I think it would be better to sit Nick Chubb than try to run him out there and potentially bring in a really low fantasy output. You're going to hear me say the same thing with the New England and Tennessee matchup for every single start and sit video this week. Is Tennessee's defense on the way towards a decline, or are they elite and Detroit is just that much better? Because they got smoked last week. Going into that matchup, Tennessee's defense was very good at stopping the run, was very good at stopping the pass, and unfortunately, they had some issues in the special teams areas and turnovers. And because of that, they got left with some short fields. But Detroit still did very good in the passing game, and Jahmyr Gibbs had a day on the ground. I personally don't think Tennessee's defense is all that bad, and I think last week was just a mixture of the special teams issues, playing on the road in Detroit, and just having overall a potentially bad game. Their defense is still very good, and they're going to cause problems for New England this week. Ramondre Stevenson wasn't all that bad last week. He had 2 touchdowns, he had a 2-point conversion, but his efficiency was awful. This week going up against Tennessee, his ceiling really only sits about mid-level RB2 for me, and his floor is one that is not that high as well. He's definitely going to be a really risky option that you need to hope you get some type of a touchdown for him. But maybe he can find an open hole like Jahmyr Gibbs did and either bring in at least 1 or 2 big runs or a touchdown. But it's the exact opposite for Tony Pollard, who could be in for a huge day against this New England defense. Right now, they're allowing the 2nd most rushing touchdowns, the 3rd most fantasy points, and the 4th most rushing yards to opposing running backs. Tony Pollard has been super solid this season and has given us a pretty decent floor all year long. This week, though, is where we finally potentially see him reach that ceiling, especially if they're not wanting to throw the ball nearly as much. We saw some really decent runs from Najee Harris against this same Giants defense last week, and hopefully Brian Robinson Jr. can do the same thing. Now, my only concern with Brian Robinson is that New York allows a lot of rushing yards to the quarterback position, and Jayden Daniels is known for running the ball a little bit. So because of that, he could end up losing some touchdown potential to Jayden Daniels. And if that happens, now we're looking at a guy who probably has a floor of like 8 to 10 fantasy points with not a really high ceiling. If you're okay with that, then we're absolutely starting Brian Robinson. But if you need some more help as your RB2 and you're hoping that someone has more upside, then we may need to evaluate somebody else that could bring you some more fantasy points than what B-Rob has the opportunity for this week. Well, it looks like Tyrone Tracy is officially the guy in New York now, and I absolutely love that. For those of you that bought the draft guide, Tyrone Tracy was one of my sleeper candidates this season to come in and take the job away from Devin Singletary. Make sure in the comment section down below if you bought the draft guide and you've had your eye on Tyrone Tracy, throw some fire in the chat or something like that so I know that you were paying attention to what ended up being one of my biggest calls of the season. And this week, this is a pretty good matchup going up against Washington. He ran for 145 yards this past week. He did have one really big run, but even if you took that away, he still had 18 carries for 100 yards after that. He was really, really good against a tough Pittsburgh defense, and now he gets a better matchup against Washington. It's now been 4 weeks since Alvin Kamara was an RB1, and over the course of those 4 weeks, he was only an RB2 twice. Now, hopefully this week going up against Carolina, he can make up for all of those poor performances because Carolina can't stop anybody except apparently Javonte Williams, who was supposed to have a big week last week and just couldn't figure it out. Carolina is currently allowing the most rushing touchdowns, the most fantasy points per game, and the 2nd most rushing yards to opposing running backs. This is where we need to get Alvin Kamara back on track. I don't care about the broken hand. I don't care if it's Derek Carr starting at quarterback, or Spencer Rattler, or Taysom Hill, or Bob from Section 325, Row D, Seat 1 that just finished his 6th beer of the game. It doesn't matter to me. Alvin Kamara needs to take advantage of this matchup. And if he doesn't, we need to have a serious conversation about what he could do the rest of the year. Chuba Hubbard also has potentially a really good matchup this week. Now, the Saints defense is not playing as well right now as it did earlier in the season, but at any point in time, they could kind of kick things off again, and because of that, Chuba Hubbard is still a little risky for me. I think he's definitely closer to being a low-risk candidate this week than a high-risk candidate, but I still have concerns that, hey, New Orleans defense all of a sudden shows up, and if they do, they're able to stop Chuba Hubbard. Right now, the Saints are 7th in rushing yards allowed and 6th in fantasy point per game and touchdowns allowed to the running back position. So he absolutely has an opportunity to find himself with a really solid RB2 floor and maybe even potentially find himself inside the top 12 if he can also get a touchdown. Javonte Williams, do you care to explain what in the heck happened last week? 2 weeks ago against New Orleans on the road, and what we thought may have been a little bit more of a difficult matchup, you run for over 80 yards and 2 touchdowns. This past week, going up against Carolina, who you should have absolutely destroyed, you only ran for 44 yards on 17 carries and couldn't find the end zone. What are you doing? And now this matchup sucks against Baltimore. It's easy to throw on them. It's way more difficult to run the football. And we know Sean Payton has shown this season that he's not scared to let Bo Nix air it out 35 or 40 times a game. Give me a break here. Javonte Williams, unfortunately, is in a really tough spot this week. And if you're looking to probably start him, you've got a really wide range of outcomes because more than likely Denver spends the majority of the game throwing, and maybe Javonte Williams doesn't even see 10 carries. Now, Denver's defense is very good. They're solid against the pass. They're solid against the run. Derrick Henry is solid against everybody. Maybe his ceiling isn't what we would hope this week, but I'm definitely going to pencil him in for 65, 70 yards and another rushing touchdown. Tank Bigsby's value this week could end up fluctuating based on the decision of whether or not Travis Etienne will end up playing. Going up against Philadelphia is not going to be an easy task. They've only allowed 2 rushing touchdowns all season long, and they allow the 4th fewest fantasy points to the running back position. So then if there's no Travis Etienne this week, Tank Bigsby to me is more of a flex option. I really do not love his upside, and the volume that he puts together may not result in a ton of yards. You're really hoping for a goal line carry. And if for some reason Travis Etienne does end up playing, then we may need to have a serious discussion later in the week about whether or not Tank Bigsby should even find his way into our lineup against the Eagles. When you talk about safe running backs, Saquon Barkley's name is right up there with guys like Derrick Henry and Kyren Williams. Guys that are finding opportunities to get the ball in the end zone. Guys that are getting a tremendous amount of volume, and they're doing something with that volume as well. And in this matchup, yeah, there's not a ton of yards allowed on the ground by Jacksonville, but you can beat them in other ways with the run game. So even if Saquon Barkley doesn't have a high yardage total this week, getting a touchdown and maybe even a few catches definitely would help lift his value. I gotta say, it's been quite the turnaround for DeAndre Swift. The first 3 weeks of the season, the dude didn't even crack the top 37 running backs, and now he's got 4 straight top 12 performances. And Arizona is another solid matchup, allowing the 4th most fantasy points to the running back position. I definitely could see DeAndre Swift in line for another 15 plus touches this week and some nice touchdown opportunities. James Conner hasn't been an RB1 since the 2nd week of the season. However, he has been a top 24 running back all but 2 weeks this season. And more importantly, he's been healthy this year, which has really been the biggest issue for him. This matchup against Chicago is not great. Does he have top 12 potential this week? Probably not, but that top 24 potential that we've continued to see absolutely would still be in play. Jahmyr Gibbs is currently the RB5. He is yet to have a game this season where he has scored less than 10 fantasy points, and he only has 2 games this season where he's scored less than 15 fantasy points. David Montgomery is currently the RB10, and if you remove the game against Minnesota where he got hurt and had to leave the field for a while, he has scored at least 14 fantasy points in every game this year. This is the best running back duo in all of football, unarguably the best offense in all of football, with one of the best offensive coordinators in all of football. David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs should be in your lineup every single week, no matter what. I'll make sure to keep an eye on Josh Jacobs throughout the rest of the week. I saw some reports that he may have been banged up, but nobody prominent really has been talking about it. So I'm going to assume that's all it was. He was just banged up a little bit. Nothing serious, and he'll be good to go this week. Now, running backs have had a little bit more success against Detroit's defense as of recent than what we're kind of used to. But this week really relies on Jordan Love for me. If Jordan Love doesn't end up playing, you could expect probably 25 plus touches for Josh Jacobs. If Jordan Love does play and he's 100%, which probably isn't the case, even if he plays this week, he's not going to be feeling 100% with that growing strain. Maybe they don't run nearly as much with him. His efficiency may not be as good as that we would like, but with no Jordan Love, we definitely have an opportunity for a ton of volume, even if he is still a little risky. The Seattle Seahawks are currently allowing the most rushing yards to opposing running backs, and the Seattle offense is fully healthy. Stafford, Nacua, and Kupp open up a lot of lanes for the running game. So Kyren Williams this week is absolutely a player that I'm loving, and his current projection over on Underdog sits at 79.5 rushing yards. Well, guess what? I am absolutely going higher than that projection, knowing that he could be in for a huge day this week. We know that he's almost a lock to score a touchdown every single week. And now this week with enough volume, he could end up having a huge day. Heck, he doesn't even need a ton of volume because of how good this offense could be going up against Seattle. Kyren Williams could be in for a big day regardless of how the score goes in this game. For the first time in a while, I do have some concerns about Kenneth Walker. Now, Zach Charbonnet's name, not even on the graphic. Yes, he scored a touchdown last week, but it was in garbage time. It was after Kenneth Walker had come off the field because it was a blowout. Not really a whole lot to see here. When it's a neutral game script or Seattle's winning, it's all Kenneth Walker. But Walker's been a little up and down as of recent. Now, he does have 2 touchdowns in his last 3 games. Absolutely great to see. Hopefully he can find the end zone this week. But from an efficiency standpoint, over his last 4 games, he's only cracked 3.8 yards per carry 1 time. And that is scary. Does he have a good opportunity this week against the Rams? Absolutely. Is it a great opportunity? No, it is not. So I just want to keep an eye on his efficiency over the next couple of weeks and see if he can get himself back on track, continue to score touchdowns, but maybe put together some bigger games. Jonathan Taylor had a great return to the lineup last week, ran for over 100 yards and scored a touchdown. But this matchup against Minnesota has some question marks for me because Minnesota's defense has been pretty darn good against the run this season. But part of that is because typically you're passing against Minnesota way more often. Minnesota's defense gives up a ton of yards through the air. They've caused a lot of turnovers this season, which has helped limit some of the damage. But over the last couple of weeks, we've seen that defense get shredded up by Detroit and the Rams. So you really haven't had to run against them all that often. So what will end up being the game plan for Indianapolis this week, especially if Anthony Richardson ends up being the starter? Are we going to go with Jonathan Taylor on the ground, try to establish the run, pick up some yards, and that gives them a solid game? Or are they going to end up needing to throw it quite a bit? Because if that happens, that kills Jonathan Taylor's upside, especially if Minnesota continues to shut down the run. I am feeling good about Aaron Jones, though, this week, going up against Indianapolis, who allows the 3rd most rushing yards to opposing running backs. Aaron Jones's projections over on Underdog only sit at 72.5 rushing yards right now. So I absolutely want to go higher than that because Aaron Jones could be in for a very solid day. But I got to remind everybody, there's only a few more days left in our October giveaway for signing up over on Underdog, because anybody that signs up on Underdog with our code Headliners during the month of October has an opportunity to win this autographed Jonathan Taylor framed jersey. So download the Underdog app, use code word Headliners to create a new account and make a deposit of at least $10. As soon as you play in your first contest, then you're going to be entered into this contest. And then you'll have an opportunity to win this awesome piece of memorabilia that I'm sure you'll find a really great place for in your house. The Kansas City Chiefs defense have been great against running backs this season. Right now, they're only allowing 9.8 fantasy points per game to the running back position, the fewest in the NFL. The next closest team above them is allowing 12.7 fantasy points per game. That's a pretty substantial gap, even if it doesn't feel like it. Kansas City is really tough to run the football on. And if you're looking to put Rachaad White or Bucky Irving in your lineup, you got to understand that you're probably not getting a ton on the ground. If you play either of these guys, it's going to be risky, and you're looking for their potential in the passing game, because it's going to be those dump offs and those design passes to the running backs that we're really going to want to have. Last week, outside of Jalen McMillan, who saw 7 targets, Baker really focused in on his running backs and Cade Otton. So that's what we're hoping for here, is that both of these guys see maybe 6 or 7 targets this week and can put together some big plays after the catch. Kareem Hunt's ceiling this week isn't all that great. Really what we need to hope for him is that Kansas City plays in positive game script and they run the ball with Kareem Hunt to keep Baker Mayfield and the Bucs offense off the field. Or we can find Kareem Hunt with a goal line carrier too. If those things could happen, he should produce a decent floor, even if his ceiling really isn't going to take him into RB1 status. Headliner Nation, there you have it, my start and sit analysis for every matchup at the running back position. Hopefully this is helping you get ready to let things rip in week 9. Make sure you like the content, make sure you subscribe if you're new here, and turn on the bell notification so anytime we drop new content or go live, you can hop in right away. But for now, Headliner Nation, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.